My family laughed at me when I stepped out of a taxi. They pointed and mocked, saying, "She's a joke." I stood there quietly, smiling, and waited. Seconds later, a black limo pulled up behind me, and when the door opened, the person who stepped out made the entire family fall silent. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 71 years old, a widow, and I've lived a quiet life since my husband passed away 5 years ago. For most of my life, I worked as a school teacher, raising my only son, and later helping to care for my granddaughter Rachel. I never cared much about wealth or appearances. What mattered to me was kindness, respect, and living with honesty. But not everyone in my family shares those values. My older sister Susan is different. She has always loved showing off her wealth, her big house, her fancy clothes, and her expensive cars. Her son Mark grew up spoiled, following her example, and together they often made me feel small. They believed money defined respect. One summer, Susan hosted a grand family celebration at her estate. Everyone was invited, relatives, friends, and even some of her wealthy neighbors. I wanted to go, not to impress anyone, but to honor family tradition and to be with Rachel, who always supported me. Since I don't drive long distances anymore, I called a taxi. It was simple, reliable, and it got me there safely. I thought nothing of it, but as I stepped out of the cab that day, I didn't know that my choice would become their reason to humiliate me in front of everyone. The taxi ride itself had been uneventful. The driver was polite, helping me out of the car and even wishing me a good day as he placed my small handbag in my hand. I smiled warmly, thankful for his kindness. But as soon as I turned toward the wide stone steps leading to Susan's grand estate, I heard the laughter. It was sharp, loud, and full of ridicule. Standing at the entrance were Susan, her son Mark, and a small group of relatives gathered around them. Susan's voice cut through the air. "Well, look at that. Eleanor has arrived in a taxi. How predictable." She lifted her glass of wine and smirked as though she had just made the cleverest joke in the world. Mark, standing tall beside her in his expensive tailored suit, took it further. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Did the bus break down, Aunt Eleanor? Couldn't you at least borrow a real car? This is a family event, not a school field trip." His friends laughed loudly, encouraging him, while the rest of the relatives shifted uncomfortably, caught between politeness and fear of offending Susan. My cheeks burned, and for a moment, I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. It was not the first time Susan had tried to humiliate me, but never had she done it so openly, with so many eyes watching. I gripped my handbag tighter, my knuckles white, and reminded myself to breathe. Rachel, my granddaughter, rushed toward me before anyone else could. Her arms wrapped around me, warm and protective. "Grandma, don't listen to them," she whispered, her voice firm. "I'm so glad you're here. You look beautiful." Her words gave me strength. I held my head high, straightened my shoulders, and managed a small smile. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied softly, brushing her hair back with my hand. I refused to let Susan and Mark see me cry. But Susan wasn't finished. She leaned closer to her circle of friends and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "You'd think she would have the decency to arrive properly. But no, Eleanor has always been cheap, always settling for less. She doesn't belong here." Her words pierced my heart. Memories of our childhood flashed in my mind, how I had once protected her from bullies, how I had shared everything I had with her when we were little. Yet here she was, ridiculing me like I was nothing. I could feel the stares of the guests. Some looked embarrassed on my behalf, others smirked, enjoying the show. A few kind faces, distant cousins and old neighbors, watched with sympathy, but said nothing. The silence of those who knew better hurt almost as much as the laughter of those who mocked me. Mark stepped forward with a cruel grin. "Aunt Eleanor, maybe next time just stay home. This party isn't for people like you. We're trying to keep up appearances here." His words stung deeply, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little respect he had for me. I wanted to respond, I wanted to remind him of all the times I had looked after him as a child when Susan was too busy flaunting her social life. I wanted to tell him that respect is not measured by the car you arrive in, but by the life you've lived and the love you've given. But I bit my tongue. Dignity meant more than shouting back. Instead, I stood silently, clutching Rachel's hand as though it was my anchor. The more they mocked, the calmer I became on the outside, even if my heart was breaking inside. My silence made some guests shift uncomfortably, as if they realized the cruelty had gone too far. Rachel turned to face Mark, her young voice trembling but firm. "You should be ashamed of yourself. My grandma has more kindness and strength than you'll ever understand." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and for the first time, Mark looked unsettled. Susan shot her a glare, but Rachel didn't flinch. I felt a surge of pride. My granddaughter had spoken where I had chosen silence. Her courage reminded me that I was not alone. No matter how Susan and Mark tried to isolate me, the whispers around me grew louder. Some guests began to question Susan's behavior. I heard a woman mutter, "That was uncalled for." Another added, "She invited Eleanor here. Why humiliate her?" Yet Susan stood tall, holding her chin high, as though she had done nothing wrong. She poured herself another drink and laughed. "Oh, don't be so serious. We're just having fun. She doesn't mind, do you, Eleanor?" Every eye turned to me. They waited for me to defend myself, to argue, or to lash out, but I didn't. I simply gave a small smile and said, "I'm here for family, not for show." My voice was steady, even though my heart raced. That moment hung in the air, heavy and tense. Some admired my calmness, others thought me weak, but I knew the truth. This was not the end. Something was coming, something that would wipe the smug smiles off their faces and remind them of what real respect looked like. After Susan's cruel words echoed through the air, a strange calmness came over me. Inside, I was hurting, but outwardly, I chose silence. I knew that if I reacted with anger, it would only give them more reason to laugh. I had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest answer is no answer at all. So, instead of arguing, I focused on standing tall. Rachel, still holding my hand tightly, whispered, "Grandma, you don't have to listen to them." Her words reminded me of why I had come here in the first place. I didn't come to impress anyone. I didn't come for Susan's approval. I came because family still mattered to me, and because Rachel had asked me to be here. That alone was reason enough. As I stood there, ignored by some and ridiculed by others, I reminded myself that appearances mean nothing in the long run. My life had been built on love, teaching children, raising my family, and helping my husband through sickness. None of those things could be measured by cars, jewelry, or clothes. Still, the humiliation was heavy. Each laugh from Susan and Mark felt like a stone thrown at me. But in that moment of pain, I thought of Michael, my late husband. He had always told me, "Ellie, don't let people who live for pride steal your peace. Your dignity is yours. It doesn't depend on them." Those words became my shield. I decided then and there not to walk away, not to run, and not to hide. I would stand exactly where I was, calm and steady, even as they tried to tear me down. That was my choice. Minutes passed, and the tension grew uncomfortable. Some guests shifted uneasily, clearly realizing the cruelty of the mockery. A few avoided looking at me altogether, ashamed of what they had witnessed, but unwilling to speak against Susan. Mark, however, grinned proudly, as if my silence proved his point. I wanted to laugh at his ignorance, because what he didn't know, what Susan didn't know, was that this day was about to turn in a way neither of them expected. An old friend of mine, Victor Grant, had called me just the day before. Victor was more than just a friend. He was someone Michael and I had supported when he was young and struggling, long before he became the wealthy, respected man everyone now knew him to be. He had told me he would stop by, not for Susan or Mark, but to stand with me. And so, as I stood there silently taking in their scorn, I waited. I didn't tell Susan. I didn't tell Mark. I let them think they had won. That was the choice I made, to let the truth reveal itself in its own time. Then, as if on cue, the faint sound of a car engine drifted into the courtyard. At first, no one paid attention, but soon the deep hum grew louder. Heads began to turn. A sleek, black limousine glided through the gates of the estate and rolled to a stop directly behind the taxi that had dropped me off. The laughter that had filled the air minutes earlier died in an instant. Silence spread like a wave. Guests craned their necks, whispering, "Who's that? A limo?" Susan's proud smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his grin disappearing. I didn't move. I simply stood there, my hand still resting gently in Rachel's. I could feel her grip tighten as she whispered, "Grandma, who is that?" I only smiled. The driver stepped out of the limo, tall in a neat black uniform, and walked around to open the rear door. All eyes were locked on the vehicle. The air grew tense with anticipation. Even those who had mocked me a moment earlier leaned forward, desperate to see who was inside. I knew then that my decision to stay silent, to hold my ground, had been the right one. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain myself. Respect was coming, not through words, but through actions. The rear door opened slowly, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. I could see Susan clutch her wine glass tighter, her eyes wide with worry. Mark's cocky smirk had completely vanished. Guests whispered, "Who could it be? Why are they here?" I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and prepared myself for what was about to happen. The moment had arrived. Everything was about to change. The limo door swung open slowly, and time seemed to freeze. Every guest who had just been laughing at me leaned forward, their whispers falling silent. Out stepped a tall man in his 70s, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to commanding attention without ever needing to raise his voice. It was Victor Grant. To some, he was just a wealthy businessman, but to me, he was Michael's oldest friend, a man who had once sat at our small kitchen table with holes in his shoes and hope in his heart, back when no one believed in him. Michael and I had helped him through those early years, lending him money for books, offering him meals when he couldn't afford them, and reminding him that his dreams mattered. Over time, Victor had built a company, then a reputation, and eventually a fortune. But he had never forgotten where his beginnings truly were. As Victor stepped out, the air shifted. Susan's smug expression collapsed in an instant. She froze, clutching her glass of wine so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Mark blinked rapidly, looking around as though hoping someone else would explain what was happening. Guests exchanged shocked glances. No one knew what to say. Victor didn't look at Susan. He didn't look at Mark. He walked straight toward me with a warm smile, his eyes soft with recognition. "Ellie," he said, in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "I'm so glad to see you." He leaned down, kissed my cheek gently, and placed his arm around my shoulder. "I promised Michael I would always look after you, and I meant it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The very woman who had been mocked for arriving in a taxi was now being embraced by a man whose presence silenced even the proudest voices. Susan's face turned pale, and for the first time that afternoon, she had no words. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her usual arrogance melting into fear. Mark, who had called me a joke only moments before, now looked as though he wished he could vanish into the ground. Victor turned his gaze to the crowd. "I wouldn't be where I am today without Eleanor and Michael Brooks," he declared firmly. "When I had nothing, they gave me kindness and dignity. Everything I've achieved, I owe to them. And if any of you doubt that, then you don't know the full story of my life." Murmurs of shock filled the courtyard. Guests began whispering to each other. "Did you hear that? Eleanor helped him? She's the reason he made it?" Some even looked at me with new respect, their earlier judgment shifting into admiration. Susan, desperate to salvage her pride, forced a laugh and said weakly, "Oh, Victor, what a surprise. If only Eleanor had told us you'd be joining us." But Victor's eyes hardened. "You don't need to know everything, Susan. What matters is respect. And what I just witnessed here today was not respect. Eleanor deserves better." His words were not loud, but they cut sharper than any insult. Susan's face flushed deep red, and she lowered her head. Mark stared at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The same people who had laughed moments ago now looked at them with disapproval. Their arrogance had crumbled completely, and in its place stood shame. Rachel squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with pride. "Grandma," she whispered, "they'll never mock you again." I smiled softly, not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew the truth had spoken louder than I ever could. I didn't need to shout back at Susan or remind Mark of their cruelty. Victor's presence had revealed everything. The laughter that once stung me so deeply was now silenced, replaced by a respect I had not sought, but had earned through years of quiet kindness. The rest of the gathering shifted quickly. People approached me with warm words, offering apologies for what had just happened. "We didn't know," one cousin said quietly. "You've done so much more than we ever realized." Others looked at Susan with disdain, whispering about her arrogance and how foolish she now seemed. For once, Susan remained silent. She had no defense, no clever remark, and no pride left to stand on. The woman who had mocked me in front of everyone was now the one everyone pitied or judged. Victor stayed by my side the entire evening, making sure I felt supported. His presence was a reminder that dignity is not measured by what car you arrive in, but by the life you've lived and the love you've given. As the limo waited to take us home later that night, I walked past Susan and Mark without saying a word. I didn't need to. My silence was stronger than anything I could have said, and judging by their downcast eyes, they understood that too. That day, the balance had shifted. I was no longer the target of laughter. I was the one standing tall. When the gathering ended and the guests slowly drifted away, I stood near the entrance of Susan's grand estate, the place where I had first stepped out of the taxi hours before. But now, everything felt different. The same people who had whispered behind their hands and laughed at me were now walking up with lowered eyes and softer voices. They offered kind words, apologies, and even admiration. It wasn't their sympathy I cared about. It was the respect they finally recognized, the truth they could no longer deny. Rachel never left my side. Her smile was brighter than ever, and I could feel the pride radiating from her. "Grandma," she whispered, "you showed them what real strength looks like. You didn't even need to say much." I hugged her close and replied, "Sometimes, child, the loudest voice is silence, and the strongest answer is patience." Susan and Mark, on the other hand, avoided me completely. Susan's head remained lowered, her confidence shattered. She had started the day flaunting her wealth and mocking my taxi ride, but now she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The woman who thrived on others' approval had been stripped of it in front of the very people she tried to impress. Mark looked equally humiliated. The arrogant smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by the expression of a boy caught in his own shame. Victor stayed with me until the end, making sure I had a comfortable ride home. His limo was waiting, but before I left, he looked at Susan and Mark one last time. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried a weight everyone felt. Respect is not about money or appearances. It's about how you treat people when no one is watching. Remember that. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Susan or Mark could bear. I didn't gloat, and I didn't feel the need to. Life had already delivered the lesson better than I ever could. That evening, back at my modest home, I sat in my favorite chair with Rachel beside me. We lit a candle near Michael's photograph, as we always did when we wanted to feel his presence. I whispered softly, "You kept your promise, Michael. You told me not to let prideful voices steal my peace. Today, I stood tall because of you." Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Grandpa would be so proud of you. And so am I." My heart swelled with love. In that moment, I realized that the opinions of Susan and Mark had never truly mattered. What mattered was the love of those who respected me, the family who valued me, and the legacy of kindness Michael and I had built together. In the days that followed, word of what happened at the gathering spread through the family. Relatives who hadn't been there called me, shocked at what they had heard. Some praised me for handling myself with such grace, while others admitted they had once believed Susan's version of me, that I was lesser because I chose a simple life. Now they saw me differently, and though I didn't crave their validation, I welcomed the shift. Susan, however, became quieter. Her pride, once so loud, seemed dimmed. She still wore her expensive clothes and still hosted her grand events. But people looked at her differently now. The laughter she had once enjoyed at my expense was replaced with judgment of her cruelty. Her words had backfired, and no amount of wealth could erase the memory of her humiliation. Mark avoided me entirely. He couldn't face me after mocking me so openly. Part of me hoped he would one day learn, that he would grow from the lesson and choose kindness instead of arrogance. But that was his journey, not mine. For me, the lesson was clear. Dignity is not tied to wealth, cars, or clothes. Dignity is tied to how you live, how you love, and how you treat others. Respect cannot be bought. It can only be earned. And no matter how much people try to tear you down, truth always has a way of rising to the surface. As I closed my eyes that night, I felt a calmness settle over me. The pain of the mockery had faded, replaced by the strength of knowing I had carried myself with grace. I had chosen silence over anger, and in the end, that silence had spoken louder than their insults ever could. Life will always bring people like Susan and Mark, people who measure worth in shallow ways. But life also brings moments that reveal character, and when those moments come, pride will always collapse under the weight of truth. I smiled, holding Rachel's hand one last time before bed, and whispered to myself, "Michael, today, we won." And that was enough. If you believe true respect comes from kindness and dignity, not wealth or appearances, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from.